I am here today to analyze one of the most seismic events of our time, something that goes far beyond the headlines about protests and repression in Iran. What I'm going to show you is that we are not just witnessing a popular revolution, but rather the largest organized assault on a national treasure in modern history, executed by the very elite who swore to protect the country. The central point here is this: while the Iranian people die in the streets fighting for freedom and bread, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, his inner circle, and the generals of the Revolutionary Guard are executing a scorched earth plan. Their goal is no longer to govern, it is to empty Iran's coffers, transfer hundreds of billions of dollars abroad, and flee, leaving behind only the ruins of a nation. To understand the scale of this plan, we first need to look at the situation on the ground. What is happening in Iran is no longer just a protest, it is a total war for existence. Field reports and circulating images, despite the internet blackouts imposed by the regime, show entire cities where security forces have lost control. Popular fury, initially motivated by political repression, was exacerbated by a much more primordial trigger: hunger. We are talking about a complete financial collapse. Hyperinflation has destroyed purchasing power, there is no money in banks, and most critically, public servants' salaries, including police and military personnel, have been delayed for months. This combination of brutal repression and economic collapse has transformed anger into despair, and despair into a struggle for survival that the regime can no longer contain. The government's response to this situation exposes its panic. Violence has become the only management tool. Estimates from human rights organizations, which I follow closely to avoid misinformation, speak of more than 20,000 dead and tens of thousands imprisoned. The regime no longer tries to hide its nature. Tehran's Prosecutor General, Alireza Aleji, publicly confirmed that summary executions of protesters will continue decisively and swiftly. What does this tell us? It tells us that the leadership knows there is no turning back, no negotiation possible. They are using terror to buy time. But time for what? Not to re-establish order, but to finalize the largest plundering operation the world has ever seen. Just a quick pause. This type of analysis, which exposes the mechanisms of power, is often suppressed by algorithms. If you value journalism that gets straight to the point, without clickbait and based on verified facts, I need your support. Subscribe to the channel and like the video. It's a simple gesture that helps me continue bringing this information to you. Now, let's get back to it. What lies behind this systemic plundering is the realization by the Iranian oligarchy itself that its power project is over. Faith in the future of the Islamic Republic, which they themselves built, has been lost. What we are seeing is the activation of Plan B on an unimaginable scale. The strategic data here is the change in objective, the absolute priority of the elite, from Khamenei to his son Mojtaba Khamenei, from Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf to the generals of the Revolutionary Guard Corps, is no longer to save the regime. It is to save themselves and their fortune accumulated over decades of corruption. They are abandoning the ship after stealing everything that is not nailed down. Let's talk about the numbers, because they give the dimension of what is at stake. The most conservative estimates from Western intelligence agencies and Iranian opposition sources, which I have cross-referenced with financial analyst reports, point to an asset transfer of between $200 billion and $250 billion. To put this in perspective, it is a value that exceeds the GDP of many countries. This is not about embezzlement or isolated corruption, it is the liquefaction of a state. It is the final result of a process of economic capture that culminated in the creation of conglomerates like Seeded, an entity controlled directly by Khamenei and which, as early as 2013, according to a Reuters investigation, had assets valued at $95 billion, many of them obtained through the expropriation of ordinary citizens' property. The operation to withdraw this capital is multifaceted and sophisticated, designed to circumvent international sanctions. A significant portion is carried out through digital transfers. Billions of dollars are being moved through parallel banking networks and shell companies in Dubai, Istanbul, and mainly Moscow. They use a combination of methods, including crypto assets and the Hawala system of informal transfers, to erase traces and escape the surveillance of the SWIFT system, which monitors global banking transactions. It is a clandestine financial operation of state magnitude, operated by the very men who control the state. But it is not just digital money. What confirms the urgency and terminal nature of this flight is the physical evacuation of assets. British MP Tom Tugendhat, chairman of the Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee, publicly cited alarming intelligence reports. He described a systematic airlift between Tehran and Moscow. Open-source intelligence, OSINT, air traffic data, seems to corroborate these reports, showing an unusual increase in flights of large-capacity military cargo planes, specifically of the Bangkok AL-76 TD model, on this route. Intelligence suggests that these planes are not carrying weapons or supplies. They are transporting tons of the Iranian central bank's gold reserves, the nation's last physical backing of wealth. The domino effect of this flight goes beyond the economy. It destroys the regime's very ideological foundation. The hypocrisy is total and corrosive. For more than 40 years, this elite built its legitimacy on a fiercely anti-Western and anti-imperialist rhetoric. Now, reports confirmed by diplomatic sources indicate that relatives of high-ranking government officials and Revolutionary Guard members are queuing at embassies in European capitals, such as Paris and London, seeking visas and refugee status. The same elite that condemns young people to death for protesting for Western freedoms is desperate to ensure a life of luxury for their children in the heart of the West they claim to despise. The search for refuge in the West while moving the bulk of their wealth to Putin's Russia reveals the purely transactional nature of their ideology. Moscow has become the preferred safe haven for a clear reason. It offers protection against sanctions and, more importantly, asks no questions about the origin of the money. Russia is positioning itself as the great guarantor of the Iranian elite's escape, receiving stolen assets and preparing to possibly receive the fleeing leaders themselves. This alliance is not ideological. It is a pact between kleptocracies where one helps the other to survive in exchange for a slice of the plunder. However, this operation is not going unnoticed. The United States Treasury Department is on high alert. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent made a public statement that sounded like a direct warning to Khamenei and his circle. He stated that the U.S. is actively tracking these capital flows and that Iranian leaders will not be able to keep them. What this changes is that the race is now not only against the revolution in the streets, but also against a global network of financial intelligence determined to freeze and confiscate these assets. The Iranian elite is trapped between the fury of its people and the vigilance of its international adversaries. This external pressure exacerbates the most dangerous fissure for the regime, the one opening within its own repressive apparatus. The Basij militias and low and mid-ranking members of the Revolutionary Guard are the last wall protecting the elite. They are on the front lines, facing an enraged population, but they are not being paid. And thanks to information leaks and inevitable word of mouth, they are discovering that their supreme commanders, the same ones who send them to their deaths, are preparing a golden escape with the money that should pay their salaries. The feeling this generates is one of deep and absolute betrayal. For a soldier or militiaman who risks his life for a cause, discovering that his leaders are secretly emptying the country's treasury is the final blow to loyalty. Local reports, though difficult to verify independently, suggest an increase in cases of desertion and refusal to obey orders to shoot civilians. The chain of command, which depends on discipline and trust, is beginning to paralyze. The regime is not just losing control of the streets, it is losing control over its own watchdogs. What we are seeing, therefore, is complete disintegration. The structure of the Iranian state is being corroded on all sides, by a population that has nothing left to lose, by an economic crisis that paralyzes the nation, by international surveillance that tightens the financial noose, and, most importantly, by a leadership that has become the main agent of national destruction. They are no longer governing, they are liquidating assets. The Islamic Republic, as a political and ideological project, is already dead. What remains is a hollow carcass, and the dispute now is over who gets the spoils. This situation has a direct and ironic historical parallel. While watching all this from exile, Reza Pahlavi, the son of the Shah deposed in 1979, sees history repeating itself on an amplified scale. The revolution that overthrew his father accused him of being a puppet of the West and of having stolen Iran's riches. Today, the leaders of that same revolution are being accused of exactly the same things by their own people, but on a scale of rapine and brutality that makes the Shah's regime seem modest by comparison. The revolution, as so often in history, is devouring its own creators. Everything I have described so far, the collapse in the streets, the savage repression, the gold airlift to Moscow, would already be enough to seal the regime's fate. But there is a final piece of information, the most explosive of all, that confirms that the end is not a question of if, but of when and how. Intelligence assessments obtained by the Times newspaper and corroborated by a former high-ranking Israeli intelligence official reveal something that goes beyond the flight of generals or ministers. They point to the existence of a documented escape plan for the supreme leader himself, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, a detailed plan to abandon Tehran. And the details of this plan, which I will reveal in the second part of this analysis, show how close Iran is to total collapse. This plan is not just a behind-the-scenes theory, it has concrete logistical outlines. The information indicates that Khamenei would be evacuated with his 20 closest advisors and immediate family members, an absolute circle of trust. The destination, as already indicated by the gold airlift, is Russia. What we are seeing is the activation of an end-of-regime protocol previously negotiated with the Kremlin. He is literally following in the footsteps of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who fled to Egypt in 1979. The irony is brutal. The leader of the revolution that overthrew a monarch for supposedly handing over the country to foreign interests is now preparing to take refuge under the protection of Vladimir Putin after overseeing a plunder on a much larger scale. The escape operation of the supreme leader himself is the final and most delicate phase of the entire process of emptying the country. This is not a clandestine flight, but an organized extraction at a state level, likely using the same military infrastructure that has transported the gold. Russia is not just receiving the stolen assets, it is preparing to receive the fugitive himself, offering him a safe sanctuary away from the reach of international justice or the fury of his own people. This solidifies Moscow's role as the main facilitator of the Iranian collapse, transforming the strategic alliance into a life insurance policy for a kleptocracy in its last days of existence. The symbolic impact of this revelation, as it leaks into Iran, is impossible to overstate. For the regime's most devout followers, the image of Khamenei, the guide, the successor to Imam Khomeini, the pillar of resistance against the great Satan, planning a cowardly escape, is the ideological death blow. It destroys 4 decades of propaganda and the mystique of an incorruptible and sacrificial leadership. For the opposition and the population in the streets, it is definitive proof that they were right all along. The leader's flight is not just a tactical retreat, it is the final confession of the moral and political bankruptcy of the Islamic Republic. The circle closes. This news, or even the strong rumor of it, acts like acid on the already corroded chain of command of the security forces. The remaining loyalty among Revolutionary Guard officers and Basij militias was no longer ideological, but based on a mixture of fear and self-interest. Upon learning that the commander-in-chief has one foot on the plane, this calculation changes instantly. Why die for a regime whose leader has already given up on it? The order to shoot compatriots becomes not an act of state defense, but a personal security service to allow the escape of a traitorous elite. The disintegration of loyalty accelerates exponentially in the final hours. It is at this point that the collapse of the repressive apparatus becomes visible and irreversible. Images and reports from cities like Isfahan, Shiraz, and Tabriz show scenes that were unthinkable just a few weeks ago. Police abandoning their posts, Revolutionary Guard units refusing to leave their barracks, and in some cases, handing over their weapons to protesters. There is no centralized confirmation, but the sum of evidence from open sources paints a clear picture. The state has lost its monopoly on violence. The structure that kept the population under control is not being defeated in combat, it is simply dissolving, evaporating in the face of its leader's betrayal. The central government in Tehran effectively becomes a fiction. With communications cut and roads blocked by strikes and protests, local commanders are isolated. Each is forced to make an individual decision, fight a losing battle, try to flee with whatever they can, or switch sides. This fragmentation paralyzes any coordinated response. The regime does not fall by a single decisive blow, but dies by 1,000 cuts as its authority unravels city by city, barracks by barracks. What remains in Tehran is just a bunker of leaders planning their own salvation, while the country they governed ceases to exist under their command. The collapse in Tehran sends tremors throughout the Middle East, destabilizing what was known as the Shiite Crescent. Paramilitary groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon, militias in Iraq and Syria, and the Houthis in Yemen, all dependent on Iranian funding, weaponry, and command, are suddenly left orphaned. The flow of hundreds of millions of dollars that sustained their operations simply dries up at the source. Their patrons in Tehran are no longer answering the phone. They are busy emptying the central bank. This abrupt interruption creates an immediate power vacuum in several conflict zones in the region. For regional adversaries like Israel and powers like the United States, this implosion is a strategic event of the first order, something that decades of sanctions and secret operations failed to achieve. The main source of instability and terrorism in the region is self-immolating. The stance of Washington and Tel Aviv, according to diplomatic sources, is one of careful observation, avoiding any direct intervention that could be used as propaganda by the dying regime. They are allowing the collapse to run its natural course, aware that the fall of Iranian central power reshapes the entire strategic map of the Middle East in their favor, even if it creates short-term uncertainties. Iran's network of proxies now faces an existential crisis. Without money and direction from Tehran, the internal cohesion of these groups begins to fracture. Rival leaders within Hezbollah or Iraqi militias may fight for control of remaining resources or seek new patrons. The collapse is not just military and political, it is financial. The entire architecture of power that Iran built over 40 years, projecting its influence through proxy forces, crumbles not due to an external military defeat, but because its command center went bankrupt and fled with the cash. Regional destabilization is the inevitable consequence. Back in Iran, with security forces in disarray, the popular tide becomes a tsunami. Protesters, now accompanied by defectors, advance on the symbols of the regime's power. Reports indicate the fall of government buildings, the invasion of the headquarters of state radio and television, the main propaganda machine, and, most symbolically of all, the liberation of political prisoners from the infamous Evin prison in Tehran. These are no longer protests, they are the final acts of a revolution that is taking physical control of the country. The capture of these locations is not just a tactical victory, it is the visual and practical annulment of the old regime's authority. The atmosphere in the streets is a mixture of euphoria, relief, and deep anxiety about the future. With the fall of central power, popular committees begin to form spontaneously to protect neighborhoods, distribute food, and ensure a minimum of order. The immediate priority of the population is not just to celebrate, but to prevent total chaos and widespread looting. They understand that, although they have overthrown a tyranny, they have inherited a bankrupt and plundered state. The task ahead of them is monumental, and the absence of a unified opposition leadership makes the next steps dangerous and uncertain. For regime officials who failed to escape, the day of reckoning arrives quickly. Many are captured trying to flee or hide. Revolutionary Guard generals, ministers, and high-ranking clerics who days earlier held the power of life and death over millions now see their fate in the hands of the same population they oppressed. The Islamic Republic's power system, which seemed so monolithic and invincible, completely disintegrates in a matter of hours. Its fall was not negotiated, it was a total collapse under the weight of its own corruption and the fury it generated. At the end of this process, reality sets in. Iran's theocratic regime, after more than 4 decades, no longer exists as a functional entity. Ayatollah Khamenei and his inner circle, according to the latest flight tracking information, managed to flee, taking with them the equivalent of $250 billion of national wealth. They left behind an economically devastated country, with institutions in ruins and a population facing the Herculean task of rebuilding a nation from scratch, without the resources that were stolen from them. The victory against tyranny was won, but it was a bitter victory. The battle now shifts from the physical sphere to the financial and legal. While a provisional government tries to establish itself in Iran, the main task of the international community and the new Iranian leadership will be to hunt down, freeze, and repatriate the billions of dollars plundered. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessant's promise that Iranian leaders will not be able to keep their assets will be put to the test. This will be a war fought in courts, tax havens, and diplomatic negotiations, a struggle to recover the future that was stolen from the Iranian people in the final act of betrayal by their former rulers. The historical cycle that began in 1979 has reached its definitive end. The Shah fled with a fortune, but the Ayatollahs who overthrew him executed a plunder on a scale he never imagined. Khamenei will live the rest of his days as an exiled fugitive in Moscow, a figure who will go down in history not as a revolutionary leader, but as the head of the largest state-looting operation of the modern era. For the Iranian people, the long night of theocratic tyranny has ended. The struggle for freedom was won with blood and sacrifice. The struggle for stability, justice, and prosperity in a country deliberately driven to bankruptcy is just beginning. The Iranian regime was not just overthrown. It self-destructed in the largest act of plunder in modern history, leaving behind a country in ruins and a people victorious but bankrupt. The question that remains is, with the elite in flight and the national treasury empty, what will be the true price of freedom for the people of Iran? Leave your analysis here in the comments. I really want to know what you think. To not miss the developments of this story and other analyses like this, subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. If you want to help us keep this independent journalism on air, click the join button and directly support our work. Now, watch the recommended video appearing on the screen. A big hug and see you next time.